Mount Royal University political scientist Laurie Williams and Melanie Thomas, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. Good evening, ladies. Welcome back to Alberta Prime Time. All right, Laurie, let's start with Kenny's reaction to the Trans Mountain roadblock. He agrees there should be an immediate appeal of the federal court decision to the Supreme Court. Would you have expected anything different?
Well, that's one of the things that's being floated, but that's not going to be a quick response or solution. I mean, the court decision itself actually said that this could be a relatively short delay and specified, I mean, there have been lots of challenges brought, 17 court cases won, and all but 2 of the claims made in this court case were set aside. So on those 2 points that need to be looked at, the court seems to think the response could be relatively short. And then we also have environmental studies and species impacts that have been done by other departments in the government. And so looks to me like that would be a faster route to go.
There are those who suggest they'll walk away from it now before you waste even more money.
Where's the evidence to support that assertion, though? I mean, being cautious and slow to make sure that you don't make a misstep in response to a major policy setback is not the same thing as saying, I'm just going to throw away, what was it, $8 billion? And so in this sense, the one area where the Trudeau government did rush was in keeping the old Harper government rules when it came to NEB consultations. And so in that sense, I mean, the lesson could be learned if you had just taken time to do due diligence at every single stage of that, especially at the cabinet level, we might not have even ended up here in the first place had a lot of those other steps had been done. And so I would really caution against this interpretation that simply because people are actually going to be doing things carefully now, that must mean that they've thrown us under the bus. I don't think that there's any evidence to support that narrative at all.
Okay, so Melanie, what's the likelihood Rachel Notley would scrap the carbon tax as per Jason Kenney's suggestion?
Nil, and I'm not entirely sure why that would actually help anything, particularly if you're looking at what at least elements of international oil and gas business that operates in Alberta has been saying for quite some time. That element of the industry has been asking for a price on carbon and has been celebrating the fact that there finally is a price on carbon precisely because then they can budget for it. And so in this sense, I mean, I see why it might be nice messaging to say, well, if this is allegedly about social license, then if you have any kind of roadblocks in getting the pipeline built, then this might appeal to some people who say that you never had social license. But in terms of the actual substance of the policy and what all of the scientific consensus is saying about climate change and how energy policy needs to match, there isn't a good empirical or evidence-based framework to use to say that carbon pricing is somehow not effective in this context. And so I really haven't heard anything from Mr. Kenney that is persuasive about eliminating the carbon tax other than to keep repeating the phrases like job killing or social license. One thing I want to highlight just to piggyback onto what Laurie had said is that there's a couple of things that I think viewers might find useful in interpreting why something like Trans Mountain is different from, say, something like Northern Gateway and what this means in terms of Indigenous relations. So Trans Mountain is, of all of these projects that have been listed, the only one where there's actually a pipe in the ground yet. So that makes it qualitatively different because there's actually something that needs to be fixed that's already there. And so expanding what's there is very different than punching something through where nothing has been before. And the other thing about the National Energy Board ruling, especially when it comes to Indigenous consultation, was that it was critical that the court was critical of the National Energy Board for not relaying information or not responding in kind to Indigenous concerns that had been raised. So the concerns were raised in considerable detail, and the board's response didn't respond in kind. It was much more vague. And so this is where I think if the electoral pressures were not so highly ratcheted as Mr. Kenney has demonstrated in the previous segment, then you could see a role for a provincial government to say, okay, so what the board really just needs to do is to actually come back with a little bit more detail to Indigenous peoples. Consultation is not consent. We will give them a period of time, maybe even set a deadline, do something that would actually bring the temperature down and put it on a simmer. I can imagine, though, if a provincial government, especially if this current provincial government did that, which arguably is an appropriate way to respond, the response from the opposition would be explosive and suggest that this is somehow the government turning their back on the oil industry or something along those lines. And so what you get is this ratcheting up of the rhetoric when, in terms of the way that I think it's best for the public to interpret this case, it's not very helpful.
Okay, Laurie, in the last week, he's also floated the idea of a referendum on equalization. How much leverage would that provide in getting the federal government to move forward on TMX?
I don't know what the connection between the two is. I'm not clear on that. It needs to be pointed out, first of all, that Jason Kenney was part of the cabinet that created the current equalization system. I think what he's trying to do is give voice to the Albertans that are very frustrated and angry about this court decision. I mean, after all, it's been years now that this process has been underway, and to be sort of slapped down yet again has left many people feeling hopeless. But he's connected the equalization to these separatist sentiments, which I think are entirely unhelpful. He himself acknowledges that separatism wouldn't solve this issue. It's not going to get the pipeline built. It's not going to get Alberta oil to Tidewater. So it's probably a non-starter. What instead he's trying to do, and indeed Rachel Notley is doing the same thing, is trying to advocate for Alberta's interests against the federal government and just picking up an issue that has some people thinking there's perhaps unfairness in place. Now, equalization is meant to help have-not provinces to have the same kinds of government and social services across, or at least comparable services across the country. And Alberta was once a recipient. As a have-not province, it was a recipient of those revenues. That doesn't exist currently. In 2017, Alberta had the fastest growing economy in the country. There's no question there are economic difficulties here, but Alberta does not qualify as a have-not province. So that just has to be understood as, unless you scrap equalization entirely, that's not going to happen. The other thing that I don't quite understand about what Jason Kenney is proposing is this notion that somehow or another Alberta is giving this money. This money is coming from the taxes, the income taxes of Albertans, and that belongs to a constitutional authority that exists in federal hands. I'm just not...
Like they're federal taxes. This
right,
is the part
right.
that drives me crazy about this.
Right, so
like
it's just not at all clear how this is doing anything but responding to those who are upset about the decision, who may think separatism is a good idea, or perhaps because they misunderstand equalization, want the Alberta government to do something about it.
Okay, and Melanie, I want your perspective as well on Kenney introducing the prospect of Albertans entertaining separatism sentiments. It came up in a Don Martin interview. What do you make of that?
So my inner cynic wonders whether or not they've tested this and it's really good at driving up donations in a short-term kind of way. Because if I'm approaching this as a political scientist who studies Canadian federalism, who also studies separatism in Quebec, as well as in places like Scotland and Catalonia, Alberta doesn't have grounds for a grievance, not like other places do, especially when it comes to having historical autonomy in the past, having that being taken over by some kind of colonial power, any of the other sorts of things that we would look for that actually legitimately motivated long-standing kinds of separatist movements. Like, they're just a non-starter here. One of the things that we do have a long and storied history of, though, is in Alberta, if we're angry about something, we form new political parties to try to address it. And so, well, like, in that sense, we're kind of ecclesiastical. What I find, so in this sense, I find the idea that we're fanning the flames of separatism to be actually really quite irresponsible. In addition to Laurie saying that it doesn't actually make sense, I think in terms of democratic norms and social cohesion, this is a dangerous game to play. I think it's especially dangerous when the equalization formula is these are federal dollars. Like, the assumption that's being made is that somehow if the federal government, if we didn't have equalization, the federal government wouldn't tax us as much as they wanted to, which to me is a bit of a non-starter as well. And I understand that it's difficult for some Albertans to reconcile the idea that after 2014, when the price of oil starts to go down precipitously and a lot of Albertans start to hurt, we still were at the top of the financial pile in Canada from coast to coast to coast. And so I understand that this is a struggle. Even at the depths of our recession, we still pulled in, we still had income and access to income that was greater than many Canadians living in other parts of the country. Like, that's a bit of a disconnect, and I can understand why some people might not want to believe that, but that's empirically the truth. And so that's why equalization, it's an easy thing to try to kick at, but in terms of the actual substance of it, it's just a non-starter.
By saying Ottawa is acting with a sense of urgency, but she punctuated that with, now the question is, do they act fast enough? What's your read on the Premier's degree of patience?
I mean, the photo from that particular meeting that ran in many of our print journalism outlets was really quite striking, because it shows Premier Notley standing being very skeptical while the Prime Minister is much more open and wanting to shake her hand, and she's not really having much of it. And in this sense, it makes it the Premier's being very clear. Having Alberta on side as an ally for some policies that may be more or less popular, depending on what part of the country somebody is in, isn't necessarily a guarantee. And that's why I think it was I can imagine for people who are environmentalists, it was potentially disappointing, but this is why I think it was relatively smart for the Premier to pull out of the federal government climate plan. They're not actually changing provincial climate policy, so Alberta is still doing the work, but they're basically saying, we're not going to give you any social license if you don't get the show on the road with this. In that sense, I'm not quite sure what else could have been done. The number one comment I have about the Trudeau federal government, and this starts back in even early 2016 going forward, is that they're a government that moves slowly. They missed the court-imposed deadline for physician-assisted dying back in 2016. They're missing their own deadline for marijuana. I mean, this is the sort of thing where these are policies that would have been easy wins for the government, and still the process grinds slowly. And so in that sense, if I were looking from the perspective of an Albertan, I would say that there's plenty of factors that I can't control that dictate that, or that lead this government, the federal government, to move slowly. And so I wouldn't expect them to be particularly speedy on this, even though, as we've noted before, what really just needs to be done is that the NEB needs to be instructed to refine what they've already done in consultation to actually respond in appropriate detail to the Indigenous concerns that were raised, and to do one more environmental assessment, and to do that properly. Like this is something that is plausibly done in a couple of months. Okay. Whether or not, yeah.
Laurie, but how long should Albertans expect to be kept in the dark in terms of what Ottawa's response will be?
I think there's a bit of frustration because the response is slow, but this is a difficult set of questions to answer, and the federal government has to be very careful in terms of its response and try to make sure that whatever response it is doesn't lead to another decision that quashes or delays the pipeline. So they're trying to be careful. I think they're recognizing some of the difficulties there.